The air felt heavier that morning. Carlos climbed one step, then another, and then he stopped. His heart was pounding, his breath shallow. A cold sweat dripped down the back of his neck. His legs trembled beneath him. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air wouldn't come easily. Something was wrong. Carlos leaned against the railing, gripping it tight. His vision blurred for a second, and a strange dizziness settled over him. It wasn't normal. He had always been an active man, strong and independent, but lately, things had changed. He woke up feeling drained, as if sleep no longer replenished his energy. His mind felt foggy, his concentration slipping, and worst of all, there was a dull, growing emptiness inside him, like something essential was missing, but he couldn't name it. Maybe it was just aging, he told himself. Maybe he had been pushing too hard. But then it happened again. A few days later, as he carried groceries into the house, that same crushing fatigue returned. His arms felt weaker, his breath short, his heart raced with no reason. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Something had changed. His body wasn't the same. But why? At lunch with his daughter, Mariana, he forced a smile, trying to act normal. "You okay, Dad?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "Just tired," he replied, waving it off. "Getting older, you know." She didn't seem convinced, but she didn't push. Carlos wanted to believe it was nothing, but deep down, a small voice whispered, "What if it's something serious?" He ignored it. Until one evening, climbing those same stairs again, he barely made it to the top. This time, his knees buckled. A sharp pressure clenched his chest. He gasped, gripping the banister to keep himself upright. Fear wrapped around his mind. No more ignoring it. No more excuses. He needed answers. Sitting in the doctor's office, Carlos tapped his fingers on his knee. He hated hospitals. The sterile walls, the scent of disinfectant, the quiet hum of people waiting. It all felt final. Dr. Hendricks, a man in his 60s with sharp blue eyes, glanced at his test results. "Well," the doctor said, flipping through the pages, "your cholesterol is within a normal range. Blood pressure is a little high, but nothing alarming. Blood sugar is fine." Carlos frowned. "Then why do I feel like this?" The doctor set the papers down. "Tell me more about your daily life. How's your diet?" "I eat fine. Exercise. Not as much as before, but I try." "And your sleep?" Carlos sighed. "Terrible." Dr. Hendricks nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. He studied Carlos for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "What about your sex life?" Carlos stiffened. The question hit him like a slap. He wasn't expecting that. "What?" The doctor folded his hands on the desk. "Your intimate life, Carlos. When was the last time you were sexually active?" Carlos hesitated. He shifted in his chair, suddenly aware of the weight of the question. I don't know," he muttered. "It's been a while." "How long?" He swallowed. "Years." The doctor nodded, as if he had just confirmed something. "That might be part of your problem." Carlos blinked. "What?" "Sex isn't just about pleasure," Dr. Hendricks said. "It plays a vital role in your body's function. It regulates hormones, strengthens your immune system, and keeps your cardiovascular system active. When someone suddenly stops, the body reacts, sometimes in ways they don't expect." Carlos sat in silence. His brain raced, trying to piece it all together. "Wait," he said, shaking his head. "You're saying my symptoms could be because I haven't been—" The doctor nodded. "Exactly." Carlos exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "I've never heard that before." Dr. Hendricks scribbled something on a notepad. "I want you to read these studies. Go home, think about it, and we'll talk next week." Carlos took the paper, but his mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. Could it? He walked out of the office, the words replaying in his head. And the body reacts. Sometimes in ways they don't expect. What if everything he had been feeling, the exhaustion, the foggy brain, the loss of motivation, wasn't aging? What if it was something he could actually fix? Carlos sat in his living room, staring at the slip of paper Dr. Hendricks had given him. The words on it felt heavier than they should. He picked up his phone, hesitating for a moment before typing into the search bar, "Effects of sexual inactivity on health." The screen filled with articles, medical journals, and expert studies. Carlos clicked on the first one and started reading. What he saw shook him to his core. Study after study confirmed the same thing. Long-term abstinence could weaken the immune system, increase stress and anxiety, raise the risk of cardiovascular disease, and even lead to cognitive decline. His heartbeat quickened. The longer he read, the clearer everything became. The exhaustion, the brain fog, the insomnia. They were all listed as potential effects. And the worst part? It had nothing to do with aging. Carlos felt a pit form in his stomach. He had spent years accepting these changes as something inevitable, something that just happened to people his age, but that wasn't the truth. He wasn't just getting older. His body was deteriorating because it lacked something essential. His fingers trembled as he scrolled down. The research explained how sex wasn't just about pleasure. It played a critical role in overall health. It triggered the release of dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins, chemicals that regulated mood, reduced pain, and strengthened emotional bonds. Without those chemicals, people became more prone to depression, stress, and even memory loss. Carlos swallowed hard. He clicked on another article, then another, absorbing every word. How many others were suffering from the same thing, completely unaware? He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The realization was crushing. He had let this happen to himself. And the most terrifying thought of all, what if it's too late to reverse it? Carlos barely slept that night. He tossed and turned, his mind replaying everything he had read. He wanted to dismiss it, to believe it was exaggerated. After all, he was still alive, still functioning. Maybe this was just some New Age nonsense designed to scare people. But deep down, he knew better. He had felt it. The slow decline, the missing spark, the way he had become a version of himself he barely recognized. And now that he knew the truth, he couldn't ignore it. But what was he supposed to do about it? It wasn't like he could flip a switch and go back to how things were. Years had passed. His life had changed. That thought weighed on him like an anchor. He found himself staring into the bathroom mirror, really looking at himself for the first time in a long while. His reflection told a story he had refused to acknowledge. There was fatigue in his eyes, a heaviness in his shoulders. His skin looked different, thinner, less vibrant. For years, he had told himself that this was just what getting older looked like. But now, he wasn't so sure. Carlos rubbed his hands over his face. Did he even have the strength to fix this? Or had he already crossed a point of no return? As these thoughts consumed him, a flicker of something unexpected crept into his mind. Fear. Not just fear of what had already happened, but fear of what could happen next if he did nothing. What if his memory continued to slip? What if his body continued to weaken? What if he lost the ability to feel anything? Excitement, joy, passion. That terrified him more than anything. For the first time in years, Carlos realized he didn't just want to exist. He wanted to feel alive again. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change. Carlos sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He had spent years believing his health issues were just part of aging. Now he knew better, but knowing wasn't enough. He had to do something about it. A familiar doubt crept in. Where do I even begin? His body felt foreign to him. He no longer recognized the man he saw in the mirror. Taking a deep breath, he opened his laptop and started searching. How to naturally boost testosterone and vitality. The results flooded the screen. Nutrition, exercise, hormone balance, stress management. One article stood out: How to restore lost energy and youthfulness after 60. He clicked. The article broke it down. Exercise, especially strength training. It naturally boosts testosterone and improves circulation. Zinc and magnesium-rich foods. These minerals help regulate hormones. Deep human connection, touch, intimacy, even hugs trigger oxytocin and dopamine. Reducing stress. Chronic stress blocks hormone production and accelerates aging. Carlos exhaled. None of this was impossible. He didn't need to turn his life upside down. He just needed to start. That afternoon, he drove to the grocery store and filled his cart with fresh vegetables, lean protein, and nuts. He stopped by the pharmacy and picked up a magnesium supplement. It was a small step, but it was a step. For the first time in a long while, Carlos felt like he was regaining control. The first few days were rough. Carlos forced himself to wake up early for a 30-minute walk. His legs felt heavy at first, but he pushed through. At night, he replaced TV marathons with reading, letting his mind settle before bed. Slowly, things began to shift. One morning, he woke up and realized something strange had happened. He had slept the entire night without waking up once. He sat up in bed, running a hand over his face. It had been years since that last happened. Over the next week, more changes came. His thoughts felt clearer, the fog lifting little by little. The exhaustion that had become his normal started to fade. His body, though still adjusting, felt stronger. Then, one day, something happened that nearly brought him to tears. He was at a cafe, waiting for his coffee, when he caught his reflection in the glass. For the first time in years, his eyes didn't look dull. They looked alive. Carlos smiled. It wasn't much, but it was proof. He was coming back to life. Carlos hadn't felt this way in years. It wasn't a sudden change. It was something subtle, yet undeniable. His posture was different. His steps felt stronger, steadier. Even the way he carried himself had shifted. He was waking up with energy, something he had assumed was gone forever. But it wasn't just physical. Something inside him was changing. One evening, he met his daughter, Mariana, for dinner. She took one look at him and frowned. "What?" Carlos asked, raising an eyebrow. She studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "I don't know, Dad. You look different." "Different how?" She hesitated. "You just seem lighter, happier." Carlos chuckled, taking a sip of his water. He wasn't sure how to explain it. It wasn't just the sleep or the improved energy. It was the feeling that he was in control again. That night, as he got home, he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. His daughter was right. There was something different about him. For the first time in years, he liked the man staring back at him. The next day, Carlos went to his favorite cafe. It was a small, quiet place, one where he could sit and think. As he waited for his coffee, he overheard a conversation at a nearby table. 3 men, probably around his age, were talking. "Man, we're at that stage now," one of them said with a laugh. "You hit a certain age, and all of that stuff just stops mattering." Carlos frowned, pretending not to listen. Another man nodded. "Exactly. It's just how life works. You slow down, your body stops working the same way, and that's it." Carlos set his coffee down, feeling a strange mix of emotions. For years, he had believed that too, but now he knew the truth. It wasn't aging that had taken his energy. It was inaction. Aging wasn't the enemy. Giving up was. He wanted to say something, to tell them what he had learned, but instead, he sat there, stirring his coffee, thinking. How many other people felt the same way? How many men his age had accepted this slow decline as inevitable, never realizing they could fight back? That thought stayed with him for the rest of the day, and for the first time, he realized maybe this journey wasn't just about him. Carlos couldn't shake the conversation he had overheard at the cafe. It played on repeat in his mind. Those men, speaking with such certainty, as if they had already accepted defeat. He had once thought the same way. How many others had convinced themselves that aging meant losing vitality, losing drive, losing themselves? He knew now that wasn't true. And yet, no one talked about it. That realization settled deep inside him. This journey, his journey, wasn't just about him anymore. That evening, Carlos sat in his living room, staring at his phone. He pulled up a message thread with his oldest friend, Daniel, someone he had known since college. They used to be inseparable, but in recent years, life had distanced them. For a long time, Carlos had assumed Daniel was fine. But was he? With a deep breath, Carlos typed out a message. "Hey, old friend, I need to talk to you about something important." His finger hovered over the send button. For a second, he hesitated. Would Daniel think he was crazy? Would he laugh it off? Carlos almost deleted the message. But then, he thought about the men at the cafe. The men who had given up. The men who were slowly disappearing into the belief that life was already over. No, not this time. He hit send. Seconds later, the screen lit up. Daniel. "Hey, Carlos, long time. What's up?" Carlos exhaled. It was time to share what he had learned. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for Daniel either. Carlos and Daniel met for lunch that weekend. The moment Daniel sat down, Carlos could see it. The same exhaustion he had felt for so long, the same dullness in the eyes. Daniel rubbed his hands together, sighing. "You said you wanted to talk about something." Carlos nodded. "Yeah, but first, let me ask you something." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "How have you been feeling lately?" Daniel chuckled. "Oh, you know. Getting older, tired all the time, can't sleep well, no energy." He waved a hand. "Just how it goes, I guess." Carlos leaned forward. "What if I told you it doesn't have to be that way?" Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Carlos took a deep breath, and he told him everything, about the exhaustion, the decline, the moment he thought he was just fading away, and about the shocking truth he had discovered, that it wasn't aging that had stolen his energy, but a lack of something essential. Daniel listened, silent. When Carlos finished, there was a long pause. Then, finally, Daniel spoke. "So, you're saying this could be why I feel like this?" Carlos nodded. "I don't just think so. I know so." Daniel leaned back, exhaling. "Damn, I never even considered that." Neither had Carlos, until now. And that was the problem. For years, they had all been taught to accept decline as natural. But what if they had been wrong all along? Daniel looked at him, something flickering in his eyes. "Hope. What do I do?" he asked. Carlos smiled. And for the first time, he knew exactly what to say. As Carlos walked away from the cafe, he felt something different, something powerful. He had spent so many years believing life was just about fading away slowly. Now, he knew the truth. And the truth was meant to be shared. The real tragedy wasn't aging. The real tragedy was believing you had no control. Carlos knew there were thousands, maybe millions, of people just like him, people who thought they had no choice but to accept the decline. But what if someone told them the truth? What if they knew they could fight back? Carlos pulled out his phone, staring at the screen. There was more to do, a message to send, a conversation to start, a life to change. He opened his contacts and started typing. Right now, someone you know is going through exactly what Carlos went through. Maybe it's your father, maybe it's your uncle, your friend, or maybe it's you. The decline isn't inevitable, but doing nothing is. So let me ask you, what are you waiting for?